Verbal elements of children and adolescent literature. How can you select the best from this mountain of possibilities? One way to assess the literary merit of fiction books is to analyze and evaluate the literary elements. Number 1. Writer's purpose. A good starting point for students beginning to learn more about the different types of author's purpose is to begin with the main three: to persuade, to inform, and to entertain. Persuade. With this type of writing, the author will attempt to persuade the reader to agree with this point of view and/or subsequently take a particular course of action. This purpose can be found in all kinds of writing. It can even be in fiction writing when the author has an agenda, whether consciously or unconsciously. However, it is most commonly the motivation behind essays, advertisements, and political writing such as speeches and propaganda. Students should ask themselves if they feel the writer is trying to get them to believe something or take a specific action. Inform. Many types of school books are written with the express purpose of informing the reader. Added to textbooks, we also have encyclopedias, recipe books, and newspapers. When an author's purpose is to inform, they usually wish to enlighten their readership about a real-world topic. Often, they will do this by providing lots of facts. Informational texts are geared toward imparting information to the reader with the purpose of educating them on a given topic. Entertain. When an author's chief purpose is to entertain the reader, they will endeavor to keep things as interesting as possible. Things happen in books that are written to entertain, whether in the form of an action-packed plot, inventive characterizations, or sharp dialogue. Not surprisingly, a great deal of fiction is written with the aim of entertaining, especially genre fiction. Explain. When writers write to explain, they want to tell the reader how to do something or reveal to them how something works. This type of writing is about communicating a method or a process. Writing with the purpose of explaining can be found in instructions, step-by-step guides, procedural outlines, and recipes. Often you will find this type of writing organized into bulleted or numbered points. Describe. Often writers will use words to describe something in more detail than be conveyed in a photograph alone. After all, they say, a picture paints 1,000 words, and text can help get us beyond the one-dimensional appearance of things. We can find lots of descriptive writing in obvious places like short stories, novels, and other forms of fiction where the writer wishes to paint a picture in the reader's imagination. In the case of fiction writing which describes, the reader will notice the writer using lots of sensory details in the text. Number 2. Plot. Plot is the sequence of events showing characters in action. In other words, it is what happens in a story. To keep readers involved, the plot must tell a good story. The lives of the characters in a book should be more exciting or more interesting than the readers' lives. There are 4 primary types of plots: cumulative, linear, episodic, and circular. Cumulative plots are most often found in traditional literature and pattern books. In cumulative plots, there is repetition of phrases, sentences, or events with one new aspect added with it. Episodic plots are most often used in easy-to-read books or transitional books. Although the characters and setting are usually the same throughout, there is no central problem that permeates the book. Rather, each chapter has a mini-plot complete with introduction, problem, events, and resolution. Books with episodic plots are good for children with short attention spans or for children with limited reading ability. Repetition. Circular plots have the same components as linear plots, but the resolution or end of the story shows that the characters are in the same situation as when the story started. 2 elements that can be used to move a plot along are flashback and exposition. In a flashback, the narrator. Circular plots have the same components as linear plots, but the resolution or end of the story shows that the characters are in the same situation as when the story started. 2 elements that can be used to move a plot along are flashback and exposition. In a flashback, the narrator recounts an earlier event to give the reader background information that adds clarity or perspective to the plot, but does not fit into the chronological flow of the plotline. Flashbacks that explain important relationships or the past history of a character will keep the reader from getting bogged down in detailed descriptions or history at the beginning of the book. A device similar to flashback is exposition. Passages in which the narrator briefly tells, rather than recreates in scenes, what has happened before the story opens. The opposite of flashback is foreshadowing, passages which hint at a forthcoming event. The author gives clues to the readers to prepare them for a coming event in the story and to build anticipation. 3 elements of plot. Narrative order, the way or the order in which the writer chooses to unfold the story to the reader. Chronological, events are related in the order of their happening. Flashbacks, writer disrupts normal time sequence to recount some past event. Conflict, in literature is defined as any struggle between opposing forces. This type of conflict is what drives each and every story. Without it, the story would have no point or purpose. There needs to be some struggle in order for the reader to get involved and care about what might happen to the characters. There are 2 types of conflict that can drive a story. The first is an internal conflict. In this case, the struggle actually occurs inside the character, usually the protagonist or main character. With internal conflicts, the character could be struggling with a decision he must make or with his own weaknesses in his personality. The second type of conflict is an external conflict. This conflict takes place outside of the protagonist. External conflicts are struggles between the protagonist and some other force outside of his body. The main type of external conflict occurs when the protagonist struggles against the antagonist, which is the character who mainly opposes the protagonist. However, other types of external conflicts can also arise due to other characters, acts of nature, or society itself in which the character lives. Kinds of internal conflict. Person versus person. This is the most common story conflict. Conflict may arise in every kind of relationship, from friction between a character and their overbearing parent to conflicts between heroes and villains. Person versus nature. Person versus nature or environment is particularly common in survival stories. In some novels, such as Daniel Defoe's Castaway story, Robinson Crusoe, person versus nature is the main conflict. In others, the standoff between a character or group and their environment is only part of the story. A great person versus environment conflict can thus show what your characters are made of while also planting the roots of further perils and consequences. Person versus society. The conflict between an individual and their society, the fish out of water story, is another popular source of friction in fiction. Often, these novels are satires that cast a critical eye on a society and its ethics and morals. A classic example is Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. The person versus society conflict works because Hester's individual transgression showed the cracks in the values of society at large. Even while being righteous, the spectators refused to see the flashes of ugliness, the indecent lust for violence, and other suffering in their own behavior. Person versus supernatural. Person versus supernatural conflicts could fall under person versus environment, yet the supernatural antagonist in a story may be a malevolent spirit with character-like personality or a more abstract evil force. Stephen King is one of the great masters of the person versus supernatural story conflict. In his 1986 horror novel It, for example, a group of children is terrorized by a shape-shifting being that uses the fears and phobias of its victims to take its shape, most often a clown. Person versus technology. Person versus technology is a common feature of the science fiction genre, especially dystopian novels about innovation taken too far. Stories about artificial intelligence turned malevolent, for example. Isaac Asimov wrote a number of short stories and novels built around the idea of conflict between person and technology. In his 1942 short story Run Around, he introduced the 3 laws of robotics that govern robots. These are, a robot may not injure a human being, or through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. A robot must obey the orders given it by human beings except where such orders would conflict with the first law. A robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first. Pattern of action. The pattern that the action of the story takes place. Suspense. State of uncertainty about what events will happen in the story. Cliffhanger, foreshadowing, and sensationalism. Climax. Peak and turning point of conflict. Point at which the reader knows the outcome of the action. Parts of the plot. Basic situation or exposition. Tells the audience who the characters are and introduces the conflict. Rising action. Complications that arise when the characters take steps to resolve their conflicts. Climax. The most exciting or suspenseful moment when something happens to determine the outcome of the conflict. Falling action. The conflict is in the process of being resolved or unraveled. Resolution or tying the knot. When the story's problem or conflict is resolved and the story ends. Endings may be happy or tragic. Freytag's Pyramid. Gustav Freytag was a 19th century German novelist who saw common patterns in the plots of stories and novels and developed a diagram to analyze them. He diagrammed a story's plot using a pyramid like the one shown here. Character. In children's literature, character is used to mean a person or personified animal or object that performs the action of the plot. Every story must have main characters. These are the characters that will have the greatest effect on the plot or are the most affected by what happens in the story. There are many ways to categorize main characters: protagonist or antagonist, dynamic or static character, and round or flat characters. A character can also often fit into more than one category or move through categories. Types of characters. Protagonist. Nearly every story has at least one protagonist. A protagonist is a main character who generates the action of a story and engages the reader's interest and empathy. The protagonist is often the hero or heroine. Antagonist. The opposite of the protagonist is the antagonist. An antagonist is a character who opposes the protagonist. Dynamic. The concept of dynamic and static characters is closely tied to character development. A dynamic character is one who goes through some sort of change. They show character development. A protagonist is usually a dynamic character. Dynamic characters change throughout the story. They may learn a lesson, become bad, or change in complex ways. Static. Static characters, on the other hand, are those who do not change throughout the course of the story. They serve to show contrast to dynamic ones, refusing to grow and remaining in one place or mentality. Characters who are static do not change throughout the story. Their use may simply be to create or relieve tension, or they were not meant to change. A major character can remain static through the whole story. Foil. A foil is a character that has opposite character traits from another, meant to help highlight or bring out another's positive or negative side. Many times, the antagonist is the foil for the protagonist. Flat. A flat character has one or two main traits, usually only all positive or negative. Round. These are the opposite of the flat character. These characters have many different traits, good and bad, making them more interesting. Stock. These are the stereotypical characters such as the boy genius, ambitious career person, faithful sidekick, mad scientist, etc. Characters are what make stories. Without a character, there is no story to tell, only a lot of scenery. Many characters in literature, television series, and movies have a huge impact on people. Some people like to live their lives through these characters, who appear to have more exciting lives. Also, these characters may seem so real and inspirational that people forget they are fictional. Characterization and the process of revealing the personality of a character in a story. Steps to the characterization process. A writer can reveal a character in the following ways: letting up hear the character speak, describing how the character looks and dresses, letting us listen to the character's inner thoughts and feelings, revealing what other characters in the story think or say about the character, showing us what the character does, how he or she acts. This call on the reader to take the information he or she is given to interpret for himself or herself the kind of character he or she is reading about. This is called indirect characterization. telling us directly what the character's personality is like, cruel, sneaky, brave, etc. This is called direct characterization. Setting: the time and location, when and where, in which the story takes place. It's a literary element of literature used in novels, short stories, plays, films, etc., and usually introduced during the exposition or beginning of the story, along with the characters. The setting may also include the environment of the story, which can be made up of the physical location, climate, weather, or social and cultural surroundings. Types of setting: backdrop setting. Have you ever read a story but found it difficult to figure out what time period in which the story was written or where it is? The story probably had a backdrop setting. Integral setting. With an integral setting, integral means to be a part of or important to. The time and place are important to the story. For example, a story dealing with a historical setting will have a direct impact on the plot, buses, and planes. This will have a direct impact on the events of the story, especially if there is distance involved. Purpose of setting: gives background information, provides conflict, man versus nature, man versus society, can reveal a lot about someone's character, provides mood or atmosphere. Mood: the feeling we get when we read a story, can paint images for the reader. Images: words that call forth the five senses. Setting gives context to the character's actions in a storyline. It can also create the mood, how the reader or viewer feels. It's easier to understand why the characters in the story are doing what they are doing when we know where they are. The time of the day, time of year, and ages of the characters will also affect how they act and what they say. Setting is an important literary device that is often taken for granted or easily misunderstood. Creating clear depictions of time and place in a story creates mood and moves the story along. Without setting, the plot line would be confusing and boring. A key element of a strong setting is using descriptive details, pulling on the reader's senses. Theme versus moral, and the moral of the story is, as many fables and tales go, morals are a necessary element. They are the main message or lesson to be learned from reading a cautionary story. Although themes and morals are both major ideas in a story, they are different in that themes do not necessarily serve to teach a lesson, whereas morals always do. A theme is simply an idea to be examined, whereas a moral is a clear lesson to be learned. Here is an example of theme versus moral. Theme: love. Moral: love others the way you would like to be loved. Whereas the theme is simply an idea, the moral is a message and instruction. The importance of using theme in narrative is unparalleled. The theme is the underlying idea an author is trying to convey to an audience. A story without major ideas for the character and reader to experience, think through, and learn from is not a story at all. A story, by its very nature, must have a theme, sometimes many major and minor themes all throughout. The ideas that run through narratives, enlivening them with deeper meaning to be found in real life and fiction alike. They create stories that are not dull but compelling and emotional. Point of view. Point of view is what the character or narrator telling the story can see, his or her perspective. The author chooses who is to tell the story by determining the point of view. Depending on who the narrator is, he or she will be standing at one point and seeing the action. This viewpoint will give the narrator a partial or whole view of events as they happen. Many studies have the protagonist telling the story, while in others, the narrator may be another character or an outside viewer, a narrator who is not in the story at all. The narrator should not be confused with the author, who is the writer of the story and whose opinions may not be those written into the narrative. Types of point of view. First person. The example above with little Rachel is told in the first person point of view, meaning that we are seeing events through the eyes of the character telling the story. Second person. In second person, the narrator is speaking to you. This isn't very common in fiction, unless the narrator is trying to talk to the reader personally. We see second person point of view mostly in poems, speeches, instructional writing, and persuasive articles.
Third person. With third person point of view, the narrator is describing what's seen, but as a spectator. If the narrator is a character in the story, then we are reading what he or she observes as the story unfolds. This narrator has three possible perspectives. Limited. In limited third person, the narrator sees only what's in front of him or her, a spectator of events as they unfold and unable to read any other character's mind. Omniscient. An omniscient narrator sees all, much as an all-knowing god of some kind. He or she sees what each character is doing and can see into each character's mind. This is common with an external character, who is standing above, watching the action below. Think of a person with a crystal ball peering in. Limited omniscient. The limited omniscient third-person narrator can only see into one character's mind. He or she might see other events happening, but only knows the reasons of one character's point of view is important in a story because it helps the reader understand characters' feelings and actions. Each character will have his or her own perspective, so whoever is telling the story will impact the reader's opinion of other characters and events, actions in the story. Point of view versus narrator and viewpoint. The narrator is the person who tells the story. There are different types of narrators, such as internal and external. Each narrator will have his or her own perspective or point of view as the story is told. Viewpoint is the perspective at which something is seen. Conclusion. Point of view is an important part of all writing. It makes stories interesting, gives research a serious tone, poems and persuasive works their personal tone, and allow readers to easily follow all writing. Keeping in mind the different types of point of view and when to use them will make your writing stronger. Tone. Tone affects how readers will respond to your writing. Although its effects can be very subtle, they are profound, in much the same way as a person's body language and overall personality. You may not be able to put your finger on exactly why, but different people have a remarkably different kind of presence, and the same thing is true of writing. If your diction emphasizes slang terms, for example, then the tone of the writing will inevitably be informal. Conversely, complex and sophisticated diction will create a more formal tone.